So does your action camera footage look like this? But you expected it to look like this. I'll explain why the footage looks jittery and explain the settings you need to change to get that smooth footage you always wanted. Plus later on, I'll show you the exact settings that allow you to get that motion blur look in your footage. One thing that keeps coming up with action cameras is this. People buy an action camera because they want smooth footage. They want to take it on walks or run with it, ride a bike with it, use it underwater, use it when skiing, or mount it on a cycle or a motorbike. And then they start searching YouTube for cinematic settings, and almost immediately they hear the same advice. Shoot at 24-30 frames per second, use an ND filter, and follow the 180-degree shutter rule. Set your shutter speed to 1/50 or 1/60. So naturally, that's what people do. But then when they start seeing strange things like smearing, ghosting, jitter, wobble, they wonder what's happening. Now I've had an action camera before, but really just use it for underwater shots. Pretty much left it in full auto. And as we'll see, I guess that was the right thing to do even without me knowing it. But I've seen a lot of videos saying how the Osmo Action 6 can give you cinematic shots. So great, I thought this would be the best little camera to take on my next trip. Cinematic footage, and I can also take it underwater too. So the best of both worlds. So I took it straight out of the box and wanted to see what the footage looked like. I set it up for cinema settings, 30 frames per second, shutter using the 180-degree shutter rule, so that was 1/60. And I also slapped on an ND filter in front to get the exposure correct. However, what came out was terrible. Was I doing something wrong? Was the camera faulty? How could my footage look so bad? At one point, the camera wasn't even moving, and even the trees and the flowers blowing in the wind looked soft and smeared. The footage just looked terrible. So what's going on? Well, the answer is simple. Action cameras work completely differently from a pocket camera, an iPhone, or your mirrorless camera. And once you understand how they're designed, the settings start to make a lot more sense. Let's start here. Most people think the camera only records what you see in the final video, but it doesn't. The camera actually captures a larger image than the final video frame. The white box is the final video. Everything around it is extra image area, and you can think of this as spare room. The camera needs this extra space so it can stabilize the footage later. Now let's start walking. The camera shakes, the image moves, the image rotates, and nothing has been stabilized yet. The camera is simply recording what the sensor sees. The entire image is moving around inside the larger capture area. Now the stabilization software takes over and it analyzes the movement. Then it shifts the image, rotates the image, moves it left or right or up or down, and it's trying to keep the horizon level and the scene stable. But notice something important. The camera is not physically moving anything. It's moving the image itself electronically. After the image is rotated back into position, there's empty corners appear. Those corners contain no picture information, so the software crops them away. This becomes the final video. The footage looks smoother because the image has been digitally stabilized. But there's always a trade-off. You lose some field of view because the image has been cropped. Now let's talk about the real problem. When you use a slow shutter speed like 1/50 or 1/60, Every frame contains motion blur. That's exactly what people are trying to achieve when they use ND filters. More motion blur, more cinematic motion. Now the problem is that the stabilization software now has to work with blurry frames. The software can move the image, it can rotate the image, it can crop the image, but it can't remove motion blur. The blur is already baked into each frame. The software can move a blurry frame around, but it can't make that frame sharp again. This is where the artifacts start to appear: smearing, ghosting, wobble, and jitter. The stabilization system is trying to stabilize footage that already contains motion blur. That's why action cameras often look worse when you force traditional cinematic settings onto them. Now let's compare that to the Pocket 3 or Pocket 4 camera. The Pocket doesn't stabilize the image first, it stabilizes the camera first. The gimbal physically moves the camera. The sensor receives a stable image. That means the footage starts out clean. The software has very little work to do afterwards. That's why a Pocket camera can use slower shutter speeds and still look smooth. The stabilization happens before the image was recorded. The iPhone approaches the problem differently. Instead of relying mostly on electronic stabilization like the action camera, it uses several layers of stabilization working together. First, it uses optical stabilization, where the tiny lens elements physically move to help counter camera shake. Then it uses center shift stabilization, where the camera sensor itself physically moves to compensate for movement. And finally, it adds electronic stabilization and software processing to smooth things out even further. The important thing is that some of the stabilization is happening physically, before the image is even captured. So the software isn't trying to fix a heavily shaky image from scratch. It's making smaller corrections to an image that's already much more stable. That's one of the reasons why footage from an iPhone can often look smoother and cleaner than footage from an action camera using heavily electronic stabilization. This is where I think a lot of people get confused. The goal isn't to avoid motion blur. The goal is to understand how the action camera handles footage. If you're filming mostly static scenes, landscape, buildings, sunset, that has very little movement, say on a tripod, then sure, the 180-degree shutter rule using ND filters can work. Experiment with it and you'll probably be fine. But remember when we saw the trees blowing in the wind? That was fairly stable. I was holding it still and we had a lot of blurry focus smearing. And that was just when the wind blew the trees. But cinematic scenes on a tripod is not why most people buy an action camera. They're going walking or running, cycling, skiing, mountain biking, doing water sports. And in those situations, smooth footage is usually more important than getting motion blur. So what's causing the issue? As we've seen, slow shutter speeds like 1/50 and 1/60 cause motion blur. So the action camera can't remove the baked-in blur during its stabilization, and this causes smearing in the final video. So the solution is you simply need faster shutter speeds to fix the issue. The simplest solution is to use auto shutter. Let the camera do its job. It'll use a fast shutter in bright scenes, and faster shutters give you less motion blur and a sharper frame. That's easier for the electronic stabilization during its calculations. And this is the easiest solution. The footage stays sharp, the stabilization works better, and the camera behaves the way it was designed to behave. Make sure you're in video mode. Swipe up and choose 4K 30. Choose horizon balancing for stabilization. Click on the 3 slider icons in the middle right. Then turn Pro Mode off. Select variable aperture make sure it's in auto mode. In image stabilization, set the texture and noise reduction to -1. And you can also choose 60 frames per second if you're going to slow it down later on in post. Now, if you still want some motion blur, this is a setup I've been using and can still use an ND filter. Keep the ISO range to 100/800. Keep the shutter range to 1/200 to 1/8000. And this means that the shutter won't drop below 1/200. So that's still a fast shutter if you're filming in 24, 25, or 30 frames per second. This gives the camera room to adjust for exposure, and you'll still get some motion blur. But you avoid the extreme smearing, ghosting that often happens at 1/50 or 1/60 slow shutter speeds. It's a much better balance between stabilization and motion blur. Swipe up and choose 4K 30 frames per second, or choose 60 frames per second if you want to slow it down later on in post. Choose horizon balancing for stabilization. Click on the 3 sliders icon, middle right. Turn Pro Mode on. Select exposure. Make sure your ISO is set to 100/800. Your EV value is set to -0.3. Select the S at the top left to set your shutter values, and set the shutter range from 1/200 to 1/8000. This stops the shutter from going below or lower than 1/200. Set the check mark to save it. Now you can leave the white balance in auto mode and just set it in the field for wherever you are. The tip here is set it to auto first, and then set it to manual to lock it when you're in the field, whatever you're shooting at. So for this scene, we've locked it at 5100 Kelvin. Set your image adjustment to texture and noise reduction to -1. And set your variable aperture to auto. Now you can set your color to normal 10-bit if you don't want to do any color grading later on, or choose D-Log-M if you will color grade it later on in post. And if you are shooting D-Log-M, you can turn on color recovery. Now this is not burned into the footage, but it will give you an overlay to show you what your footage will look like when it's color graded to Rec. 709. And this also makes the screen a little easier for you to see in bright sunlight, because log footage itself is really flat and washed out. So the biggest mistake people make is treating every camera the same. A pocket camera, an iPhone, and mirrorless camera are not action cameras. They all stabilize footage differently than the action camera. Once you understand that, the settings make a lot more sense. Action cameras were designed around electronic stabilization. And electronic stabilization likes sharp frames, i.e. higher shutter speeds. And that's why forcing slow shutter speeds often creates the exact problems that people are trying to avoid. So if your footage looks jittery, smeary, or soft, there's nothing wrong probably with your camera. You just probably need to bump up your shutter speed. Okay, thanks for watching. Let me know in the comments what settings work for you. I'm genuinely interested. Now, if you've learned something from this video, consider subscribing to the channel, like and comment for the algorithm, and I'll catch you next time.